Well, this morning we're going to continue on, and we are going to be, most of our time is going to be spent in Exodus 21 this morning, and we're going to be reviewing the law. But, to put it in context for this morning, sometimes the law gets it means different things to different people. We've got, different perceptions of it. But let's see what Paul said about the law in Romans 7:12. He said the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Did the law have its faults? Not necessarily. The fault was more with mankind. There was nothing wrong with the law. The law can't be faulty and be good at the same time, as Paul refers to it as good. But it had its time, and it was necessary for the people. If there was never a law, then how would we really know what God's thoughts were right and wrong is concerned? So a lot of the things in the law here it reads like a law book, and we're going to be going through some of those here this morning. So as we read these passages here in Exodus, how can we really think anything differently of the law than what Paul said about it, that it was holy, it was good? Because when you go through these passages, how could they be improved upon? How would you, as a human, tweak it and make it better? I would challenge you to do that. But God said that it's holy and it's good. So let's kind of get into the passage. In Exodus 21, I want to read verses 28 through 32. He says there, "If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. If, however, an ox was previously in the habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet he does not confine it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. If a ransom is demanded of him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is demanded of him. Whether it gores a son or a daughter, it shall be done to him according to the same rule. If the ox gores a male or a female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned." Did the 30 shekels of silver kind of ring a bell to you? It should. Because what we see here, and we'll kind of come back to that in just a moment here, but in this section, we're talking about voluntary and involuntary actions between people. And that's summed up in verses 13 and 14, just a little bit before this in this chapter here. So if an ox gores a man or a woman and the gored person dies, then the ox is to be stoned. And now if evidence is provided, then that the owner knew about it, then a different action is taken. Knew about it in the sense that the ox had previous history of goring people. But now, why would the ox be put to death? We can go back to Genesis 9, where God says that man is made in God's image. So there is a sacredness that is attached to the human life, and God puts that value on it earlier. It's when we are when it's said that we are made in God's image. Now, the second part of that passage, if the owner had been warned of the dangerous habits of that animal and did not keep it in, then he, as the owner, is held responsible. So if the person gored was a free Israelite, okay, in the first case, then the life of the owner of the ox was forfeited. But an opportunity was given to him for redeeming it by payment of a ransom. And the second part of that is if the person gored was a slave, then the owner of the ox had to compensate the owner of the slave for the loss of his servant. And that's where the 30 shekels of silver comes in. So, but in either case, the ox had to be stoned, all right? So let's kind of take a look just for a moment at that compensation price for the servant, 30 shekels of silver. Now, I'm going to go to a passage that you're probably really familiar with, but you can go if you want to, but we're going to come back here. Matthew 27. Matthew 27, the first 10 verses, says, "Now when the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death." Conferred together to put him to death. So this is premeditated. All right, they knew what they were doing. "And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' But they said, 'What is that to us? See to that yourself.' And he threw the pieces of silver in the temple sanctuary and departed. And he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, 'It is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood.'" They recognized what it was. It was the price of blood. "And they conferred together with the money they bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason, the field had been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And they took their 30 pieces of silver, the price of one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me." So, can you see the situation with the Pharisees together? And when Judas comes to them and he offers to betray Jesus, and they're figuring out what price, how much money should they offer Judas? And then one of the Pharisees speaks up and says, "You know what? It would be, how about we just give them 30 pieces of silver, because that's the price of what a slave cost." That was, if a slave gets put to death, 30 pieces of silver. And can you imagine the discussion in the room with the Pharisees? Yeah, that would be just about right. 30 pieces of silver, because he's not a free Israelite, back here in Exodus. It was the price of a slave that was 30 pieces of silver. So they didn't even consider him worthy of being the price of an Israelite. Not that a price of an Israelite was ever given, but the price of a slave was 30 pieces of silver. So there was probably lots of jesting going on. Yeah, 30 pieces of silver, that's about what he's worth. So interesting connection there. So let's go to back in Exodus again. We're in chapter 21. Pick up in verse 33 till the end. "If a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it over, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead animal shall become his. If one man's ox hurts another, so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide its price equally, and also they shall divide the dead ox. Or if it is known that the ox was previously in the habit of goring, yet its owner has not confined it, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and dead animal shall become his." So let's talk about animals here for a little bit. So the same principle, the principle of equity, if you will, applies here as it did for people a little bit earlier. If an ox or donkey falls into a pit that was left uncovered, okay, the owner of the pit is required to pay in full. But if one man's ox kills another's, then the loss is to be shared equally by both of them, by both owners. But if the owner of the ox was aware of the habit of his ox goring another and didn't keep it in, then he's the one that's got to assume the whole loss. You know, it seems kind of straightforward and kind of logical and fair, but again, we're going through laws that God has put into place so that there's no argument later. It's reading like a law book as far as here's the situation and here's the different context that you apply it. So let's kind of look at it like that. So the lesson taught here is that we really cannot avoid responsibility for our actions. Because that's what it's saying, that we are responsible for our actions, whether it's intentional or unintentional. All right? But we're also not just responsible for the actions, but for the consequences of those actions. We're responsible not only for the direct, but the indirect consequences. You know, back up in verse 22, we'd gone through that previously. That's where the case is, you know, two men are fighting and a woman that's pregnant gets injured, maybe tries to intervene a little bit and protect her husband, or she gets injured. Then there's consequences of the one that actually injured her. So it's an unintended consequence of these two men fighting. But they've got to take responsibility for the fighting that they were engaged in. So God is laying out that even involuntary acts, they're not necessarily charged against us as the same way that a voluntary act is, but he's laying out the consequences of both and how they should be dealt with. Involuntary acts are not charged against the person the same as voluntary acts is. And what I mean by that is manslaughter is different than murder. All right, murder is where there is intent to do harm. Manslaughter is where it was accidental. It wasn't intended to result in someone else's death. So again, we're responsible not necessarily only just for what we do not do, as much as what we do, in the sense that if we dig a pit and don't cover it over, then we're responsible for things that we didn't do. We didn't cover it over, but we're still responsible for those actions. Negligence, carelessness on our part, we're responsible for those. So, and then the principles that are involved in each one of those has really wide-ranging applications as well. They cover a whole range in our life. There's really not too many situations that we could bring up where we can't make these applications. You know, I heard it said one time, and I didn't believe it at first. I used to work for a company called Oceaneering in Maryland. They do a lot of the undersea ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. I was in a different section, in the entertainment section, but we had classes on accident prevention. And the instructor of the class, very first day, he said, there is no accident that is not preventable. And I thought, there's that word, there is no accident. Whenever somebody says an absolute, it's like you have to back up and say, nah, that's not true. But when you consider that statement, it is really true. There is no accident that is not preventable, whether through preventive maintenance or through negligence or whatever the case may be. All accidents are preventable. Now, I'm not talking about accidents of nature, okay? I'm talking about accidents that involved mankind. So these laws here that God is laying out here lays out the responsibility for all of our actions or our non-actions. So particularly, let's look at verse 20, where it talks about a slave there. He says, if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. So we're kind of backing up just a little bit. So the law here, this is the law that has been blamed, if you will, a stain on the law of Moses by a lot of people, suggesting that God is sanctioning slavery. He's not sanctioning slavery, but slavery was a fact of life at that particular point. God is just saying that he's not trying to overdo it or overturn it. He's just saying that if you have a slave and this happens, this is what should happen. So if a slave let me read it again. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. That's the section that really takes the hit, as though God is sanctioning slavery. He's not. But like I say, it was part of the society at that particular time. So now the slave, what they're saying is, well, he's just a possession. But let's kind of take a look at that, whether he was actually a possession in that term, that terminology. What does that possession means? The people that are claiming that this is that a slave has no personal rights hasn't really read the passage, doesn't really understand what God is saying here. Their interpretation that they put on this is really wrong, and it would really go against the entire spirit of the law as we take a look at here. The law takes an exceptionally humane view of a slave's position. Now consider the statements earlier, or actually a little bit later in verses 26 and 27. If a slave owner is punishing his slave and he knocks out an eye, that slave goes free. If he knocks out a tooth, that slave goes free. Does that sound as though that slave is a possession? No, quite the opposite. So what it's really doing is these laws here it's not punishing the slave, it's limiting what the master can do to a slave. It's actually putting limitations on the master, not so much on demeaning the personhood of a slave. So let's kind of look at the considerations here. The law deals with slavery, and I'll use the word slavery, not from the point of view of an absolute right, but as just an existing part of society at that time, like I said earlier. It takes the existence of slavery for granted because that's what it was at that particular time. The law dealt with it much as future leaders will, and I referred to that in an earlier lesson about our early Constitution in the United States. They didn't deal with slavery at that time because it was a hot button. It would have destroyed the ability to have the 13 colonies come together and actually form a country. There were 3 colonies at that time that would have had no part of it, and they would have bolted the Continental Convention. So they knew that slavery was going to be dealt with very soon. And if you put it in time frame, 75 years later, we have the Civil War. So they knew that slavery was going to be abolished, but it wasn't written into the Constitution. But even though it was very prevalent at that time. So God here is recognizing slavery is not good, but here's how you deal with it. The law here recognizes that a slave can't be treated in the eyes of a law quite as much as a free person, okay? His position is, just relatively speaking, a degraded one, okay? Not that he's less of a person, but from a society standpoint, a slave didn't have all of the rights of a free person. So the owner of the slave has really financial and proprietary rights of the bond slaves, bond servants, that the law had to take account for. The slave was I'm going to kind of change the terminology here, and it's not an accident. The slave actually represented the servant or the owner's money. Okay, and what I mean by that is, it's very similar to buying and selling land back then. You don't need to go there, I'll read it. But in Leviticus 25:13 through 16, it talks about buying and selling land. So think of land as the same as a bondservant or a slave. On this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, to your friend or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell you according to the number of years of crops. In proportion to the extent of the years, you shall increase its price, and in proportion to the fewness of the years, you shall diminish its price. And this is what I wanted to get to. For it is the number of crops that he is selling to you. So every 50 years, when you buy or sell land, it reverts back to its original owner. So if Troy sells me 30 acres and there's 10 years before the year of Jubilee, then what he's selling me is 10 years of the crops, the value of the crops, not the land, because the land's going to go back to him, all right? But I'm buying 10 years worth of crops. So the slave or the bondservant in this particular case is a monetary investment to the owner, because if the slave is a Hebrew, then he is only a bondservant for 6 years. At the beginning of that 7th year, he goes free. So the owner of that slave has that bondservant or slave, interchangeable. He is indentured, if you will, for however many, for 6 years maximum. At the beginning of the 7th year, he is set free. So the aim of the law here that God is putting out, it wasn't to put the slave at the master's mercy, but to restrict the master's power over him, as I had mentioned earlier. See, ancient law, the Phoenicians, the Gauls, and whoever else, the Egyptians, there was no laws about slaves. You could buy them, sell them, kill them, do whatever you wanted to. But the Mosaic law was a difference. There was actually, God put a humane value on a servant's personhood, on their life. So it's important to remember that the case treated here is not, we're not talking about the moral aspects of whether slavery was right or wrong, but we're talking about the criminal part of it. What was he required to do from a law standpoint? So moral offenses are not always dealt with from a criminal standpoint, and I think we understand that even today. The legal courts had authority to punish the master if the slave died under his hand. And that's, I think, an interesting point that we skip over. That if I have a slave or a bondservant, and and let's just say that in this case, in the scripture, it's usually a rod that the owner was to punish that slave or to correct them. If I take a rod to one of my servants and that servant died that day, all right, I'm held responsible, and I could give up my life for that. But if they lingered for 2 or 3 days, then it goes into the local judicial court system of whether I directly caused it or were they weak and as a result of their maybe something else happened, they were in a condition. Scripture really doesn't give a whole lot of information on that. But if they linger for a few days, then it no longer is murder. Then it goes into the court system to determine what my punishment should be. But if they die at my hand, or if I were to take something like a sword or something like that, then that's intentional. Then I, as a owner, can be held for murder against my slave. Now that's a whole lot different than I think most of us have an idea of what slavery is. We have the idea, or I did anyway, that a slave owner had life and death say over their slaves. That's not the case. If an owner killed one of their slaves and they died that day, they're held. Their life is forfeit. If they used like a lethal weapon, again, their life is forfeit for that. So, lastly, I want to get to is verses 23 through 26. We'll kind of, what he's talking about there is, but if there's any further injury, then you shall appoint a penalty for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Okay, this is actually taken off. Jesus responds in this same. He used this same passage and lifts it out in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, where he says, "You have heard it said, that an eye for an eye." Okay, and I'll just use that as an example. Sometimes it's called the law of retribution or the law of retaliation. But the law here, as we just read, it states the punishment should be in kind. And what it means is the punishment should fit the same of the crime committed. So it's just a claim that when a wrong has been done to anyone or to society, then adequate compensation has to be made. That's really the basis of a lot of our criminal justice system should be, and has been in the past, not so much anymore, has been along those same lines. That the crime has to fit the punishment. I'm sorry, the other way around. The punishment has to fit the crime. And that makes sense. I mean, it's common sense to us, but God is actually recording it here for us to understand. But sometimes where this is perverted is when we take, this is meant for public justice. Sometimes the law or people take it into the private life where it's spirit of revenge. And that's where we have the cities of refuge comes into play. And I spoke about that earlier, that they were strategically placed throughout all of Israel, that if you unintentionally kill someone, that you could go to these cities of refuge and have safety. So this passage here, an eye for an eye, is not to be taken from a personal standpoint. It's talking about from a civil standpoint. But it was perverted in the sense, in taken privately and say, well, if this person killed my sister, then I'm going to take my revenge on that person. Well, that's where the cities of refuge came into play. But what God is stating here is, this is for public. This is not to be used personally, where you're not allowed to take the eye for an eye and take your own vengeance. It's a perversion of what God is saying there. It's not for that purpose. So I just want to really kind of recognize that in all of these statements here, this in the New Testament, and that's what Jesus brings forth in the Sermon on the Mount, is he takes the spirit of love, if you will, and takes the Old Testament passages and brings them forward and helps them to recognize that was a law that they had. But from a New Testament standpoint, we're not driven by that anymore. We're to overcome those feelings and those hurts by love. The spirit that's willing to waive our legal rights and then in order to promote the good of another. That's what Jesus is talking about mostly in the Sermon on the Mount, that we're to overcome and not be driven by law anymore. So, to kind of sum up what we talked about, we started with the statement that Paul made, that the law is holy, it is just, and that's what the passages are talking about. How could we improve on any part of that law? We talked about the compensation for the death of a slave, 30 shekels, and how that folded into the price for betraying Christ. Talked about the injury to animals, whether it be accidental or by negligence. Servants dying under punishment. And then lastly, an eye for an eye, law of retribution, how that can be misused, and that we're not allowed to take vengeance. God says, leave vengeance to him. He'll take care of it at the end. So lots of good things in the law that we can recognize. But God was doing us a favor by writing the things down from his viewpoint that we can understand what good and holy means. It gives us a basis of our law systems that's been used ever since the law of Moses was written down. A lot of societies, United States being one of them, uses a lot of the laws here as our basis of our law system. So we are thankful for that. All right, so appreciate the opportunity to be up here this morning. I know the Olmsteads are on their way back today from Lima. Steve's on his way back probably real shortly. After he gets a good meal in his belly, he'll be on his way. Be a lot of people traveling. Lima was really great this weekend. If you get a chance to listen to any of those sermons, I really encourage you to. They were really good. And all of them out of the book of Colossians, by the way.